Well, thank you, Derek, and it's fantastic to be here and to be back. It has been like 12 or 13 years since I was here, which is probably a safe enough time that I have had at least one new idea and some new jokes. But under a decade, there's no guarantee. But so very exciting what's going on out there, what was going on in here, the Bold Fellows, all of the student projects. I didn't get to everything, but I heard a bunch of the student presentations and saw the posters, and it's very exciting, near and dear to my heart. So it's just wonderful to be able to speak in this context and to see so many of the students here as well as everyone else. So I want to talk about the future. I want to talk about the year 2030 because I'm really interested in the year 2030, and as I'll allude to briefly, I've been teaching a course the last 2 springs called The Future of the University as a Design Problem, and I've been co-teaching it with an architect, and our students in teams designed the university of the year 2033, placed it 20 years in the future. So I think a lot about the year 2030, and the thing about 2030 is that 2030 seems a lot farther away than 16 years seems ago, right? So 16 years ago was just like 1998, you know, and so I always say this to my students. I say, gee, 20 years in the future seems, 20 years ago doesn't seem that long. Of course, they're all 19, so they're like, well, that's what you say, old man. But so that's 2030 is just 16 years in the future. So just think about that for a second. So let's just go back sort of some reasonably comparable amount of time. So this is actually a direct quotation that was said by the person who is the director of the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, which is known as FIPSE, which is the major funding arm of the Department of Education. And I always knew that the American Studies Crossroads Project, which I directed and had funded by FIPSE in 1994, I always knew that the Crossroads Project was the first web-based project that the Department of Education ever funded. What I didn't know until like a month ago, because the project program manager, who was the program manager at the time, came up to me after a talk in Washington and told me this, was that this is what Buddy Corrales, who was the head of FIPSE, said when he was holding my proposal and the program managers were recommending that it be funded. Direct quotation. So that's 1994, to get from what the hell to that you're all going to sit here and at some point check your device instead of listening to me. Right? So that's just 20 years. If you think about the last 10 of that 20 and how fast the last 10 has gone than the first 10, right? 2004, right? You have the IPO of Google, 2004. YouTube isn't even founded yet until 2005. Facebook founded in 2004. That's just the last 10 years, okay? So that's when we think about the year 2030, which is 16 years away, it's partially to ask, like, what is the pace of change? What is the pace of change going to be like? And what we try to think about in the class that I teach is that we try to get the students to think about what it's like to design for a context, right? And to ask, what will the context of 2030 be like? Right? So let's just do that really quickly. I'll just make the most token nod to interactive teaching and learning. And so shout out. Let's just get a few things. What will 2030 do we think it'll be like? Just a category, like technology. Just shout out, anybody. What do you think technology will be like in 2030? Robots? Absolutely, robots, okay? Cyborgs, is that what you said? Okay. Well, that's pretty much it. Robots and cyborgs. We're just drinking mint juleps on the porch. What else? What's that? Well, this is just 16 years. Okay, you're getting excited, but all right. Well, if you want to go there, that's fine. Okay, no, that's great. That's right. All right. It's very good. What else? Virtual Okay, more sophisticated virtual reality, the whole nature of how we experience will probably change. About community or networking. Individualized, hugely individualized, personalized, etc. Anything else? Ultra portable. What did you say?
Huge crisis of access.
Oh, huge crisis of access, yeah. There's probably a number of crises we can name. Access, climate change, portable, mobile, people often say. I did just read this funny line the other day by Mike Caulfield, where he said that educational technology analysts have successfully predicted 7 of the last 0 mobile learning revolutions. I thought that was a funny line. I'm sorry, what did you say? Wearable, yeah. Wearable, all our technologies embedded, etc. So, right, so we could do this, you know, so that's what we do with our students. We try to imagine what is the context, what are some of what we might call the logic points of 2030, and then we sort of build that world, and then we say, well, now let's design a university around those logic points. And the questions that we like to ask them is, you know, what will, as we just said, the conditions of knowledge, technology, learning, and work be in 15 to 20 years, right? Just 15 to 20 years. Right? What will that world be like? And then what kind of graduate do we want to produce for that world? Okay? So there are a lot of ways to come at this. One of them is Levy and Murnane's work, New Division of Labor. A number of people have written about this, but their take on this is pretty interesting, in which they ask the question, what is it that humans can do that computers can't, and what is it that computers can do that humans can't? And then they ask the question, as with the first 2 responses said, what work will be left to humans in 20 years? Right? And they say the human labor market will center on 3 kinds of work: solving unstructured problems, working with new information, which includes complex communication, and carrying out non-routine manual tasks. That's most of what the jobs will be. Right? So if that's true, and of course it's possibly debatable, but some version of it's true, then what kind of education is most needed at this moment? Or what kind of education is most needed for that moment, 15 to 20 years? Or the more interesting design question is, what kind of education would only be possible, is only possible in the next 10 to 15 years? What kind of liberal education could only be possible at this point in history? So one of the reasons that I like to think about design is that this is what we kind of talk about, flipping disruption, which I'll talk a little bit about, disruption being a word we've heard a lot about the last few years, flipping disruption into design. If you're talking about disruption, then you're focused on how do we stay what we want to be despite what's going on around us. If you're thinking about design, then you're asking, what is it we want to become? What kind of university do we want to be? What kind of education do we want to produce? So that, to me, is the interesting question. This is the interesting design question. To me, students as producers, this whole day, to me, that's about this question. What kind of education is only possible in the next 15 to 20 years? So, looking forward is not the strength of universities. John Seeley Brown, who some of you may know, Xerox PARC, and wrote The Social Life of Information along with other things, makes the claim that universities are primarily equipped only to look in the rearview mirror. Right? The curriculum is basically a history of that field up until this moment. So we're not used to looking forward. So this takes some work. So, as we think about this context, I want to make a couple of assertions. Here's one of them. Our understanding of learning has expanded at a rate that has far outpaced our conceptions of teaching. What we understand to be robust learning is so much more complex than the ways we have of counting teaching and delivering teaching in formal institutions. Okay. So let me try to explain what I mean by that. So, we're almost 20 years officially into the learning paradigm. 1995, Two guys named Barr and Tagg wrote an article called From Teaching to Learning. They declared that we were moving out of an instructional paradigm into a learning paradigm, which we're mostly living out here, right? They said it's going to be learning-focused, outcomes-driven, student-centered. It's not going to focus on instruction. It's going to focus on learning. It's not going to focus on everything adding up to something. It's going to focus on the outcomes, and we're going to backwardly design the whole curriculum to it. They said, smartly, it'll take decades for the learning paradigm to penetrate higher education. It's always a very good move when you have a theory to say that it will take decades, right? I may be wrong, but I'll be dead, so it won't matter. But we're 20 years after that, and a lot's happened, and they were mostly right. But they may have, I don't know if they underestimated the traditionalism or not. So we're 20 years in the learning paradigm, shift of higher education. This, to me, combines with this expansion of understanding of what we mean by learning and the changing skill set that's required for the 21st century. So our whole notion of how people learn, 30 or 40 years of neuroscience and research on learning, what it is we think is required to thrive in this century, all that has expanded hugely, right? So we have this learning paradigm pounding away in higher education, accountability, et cetera. This whole expanded notion of what it means to be an educated person. And I would assert that there then is a growing mismatch between these aspirations for learning and our structures. Okay? So here's one way to come at this. This is a list you may or may not have seen before. This is a list of what are known in some circles as high-impact practices. Right? This comes from the National Survey of Student Engagement. Do you do NESE here? Probably not. No, that's right. Are you a Kofi school? No. Okay. We'll talk later. I'm sorry. I thought we were alone. But the National Survey of Student Engagement is a survey that is filled out by hundreds of thousands of students a year, and it's been going on for 15 years. There are millions of data points. These are the practices that when students do them, they have the highest correlation with student success nationally at all kinds of institutions. Right? Highest graduation rates, highest retention rates, the greatest correlation with deep learning and integrative learning. Right? These are what they call high-impact practices. Right? So you can see the list: first-year seminars, writing intensive courses, collaborative assignments, and other things, undergraduate research, global learning, etc. This is what they look like when they're mapped across the curriculum. So when I, as vice provost, look over my vast domains of the educational landscape, this is what I look at. I see the formal undergraduate curriculum in the center, and then what I think of as the experiential co-curriculum around the margin. And this is the distribution of those high-impact practices. Half of them are in the experiential co-curriculum, so they're not even in the formal curriculum. Half of them are anomalous in the formal curriculum. That one freshman seminar, that one capstone course, that one or two writing intensive courses. We spend all of our money, or most of our money, the vast majority of our money, in the formal undergraduate curriculum of the instructional money we spend. We hire for it, we tenure for it, we staff for it, etc. We often, this is true at Georgetown, I don't know if it's true at Vanderbilt, invest most of our sense of mission and brand in the experiential co-curriculum. Right? So if you go to Georgetown's website and look at the videos that have been mounted on Georgetown's website, I don't know why you would do this, right? I don't know who is actually watching these videos. There's a cartoon that shows a Venn diagram of one circle says things universities put on their homepage, and the other circle says things people are looking for on the university's homepage, and the only thing in the intersecting space is the university's street address. So but anyway, so if you go to the website and you look for these videos, they'll mostly be of feel-good stories around the margin, right? So our sense of mission, our sense of brand is often in the co-curriculum, but where we spend all our money is in the center. So the question is not necessarily just how do we do more high-impact practices? One question is, what is it about high-impact practices that make them high-impact? Okay? So this is the answer that they've derived over a period of years from mining the NESI and some other work. Right? So high-impact practices, these are the places where students invest time on task. Right? Or where students engage in accountable talk, the Lee Schulman term, accountable talk or accountable thought. Right? Where you give and get frequent feedback, where you're making daily decisions, or you have to make judgments in uncertainty. All the students who are out there doing their projects, there were days when you had to make decisions about how to go forward. You had to figure out how to negotiate your own goals. Right? You weren't being told every step of the way, this is what I need to do. Right? It's where we believe that students are allowed to take risks, to move outside their comfort zone. In this course that I teach on the universities of the future, all my students, the first thing they want to do, all my Georgetown students, the first thing they want to do is create a university that makes it safe to fail. They want to create a university that makes it okay to take risks. Right? And it's a place where people can integrate and synthesize and make meaning. This is what I think of as the new ecology for learning. That the places where people have the opportunity to do that, whether it's in school or out of school, whether it's online or face-to-face, is where people learn the most. Tons of data to tell us that doing those kinds of things is where learning is the richest. Formal learning, informal learning, ubiquitously. Not coincidentally, those are a lot of the same skills that probably we'll need when robots are doing all the routine work. So one of the things that I've been really interested in for the length of my career is the question of then, if that's what makes high-impact practices high-impact, what do you do about it? Right? My students, they say, you just get rid of the curriculum. That's their solution for 2033. Last year, at one point, I said, are there any faculty in your university? I said, oh yeah, they're faculty. They're like chilling. So. But I ran a Center for Teaching and Learning for 13 years, as Derek said, and like Derek does. We spent most of our time trying to help faculty think about how do you make courses more like high-impact practices. So one of the solutions, which some of you may have read this work, that I've been really interested in the last few years is around something we call social pedagogies. Some work I did with Professor Heidi Elmendorf, who's a biologist at Georgetown. Right? And for us, a social pedagogy was merely give your students an audience that's not the teacher. What we started calling an authentic audience. Right? All the projects out there have an authentic audience. Right? And that fundamentally changes the way people think about knowledge. So Professor Elmendorf, she teaches many classes in biology. One of them is a biology of global health class. The students make these public service announcements around a particular theme. So I'm going to play two for you because it's 5 o'clock. Unfortunately, I don't have things embedded because of a slight malfunction of the universe. So. So this year, all the projects were focused around these 7, what are called neglected tropical diseases, NTDs. Play one more. Same content, very different approach. It's always cool when you get assigned to a group with somebody with good drawing skills, right? So they're not complex, but they're sort of acts of careful distillation, acts of thinking about who your audience is. And this particular class is the gateway to the biology global health. Students have to engage in 5 different communication challenges, this being one of them. They have to create a website, there's a survey, they have to write a policy proposal, they have to make teaching guides for middle schoolers, and they have to write a grant proposal on malaria research. So all through the gateway, they have to take a different turn at a different act of communication. And the point here is simply this, that our notion was that the core of a social pedagogy is that we learn best when we're trying to communicate for a real audience, and that by communicating to a real audience, we actually are always continuously improving our ability to think, that our construct of understanding is absolutely connected to our desire to communicate it, right? But for that to have power, for constructing understanding and communicating understanding to have power, you have to feel like you're talking to somebody who's alive and who matters, about something that matters, right? And similarly, for communicating to an authentic audience to matter, it has to be about something that matters so that there's actually something meaningful or difficult going on. That's what we decided was a high-impact practice. Let me give you one quick other example from a class that I taught a couple years ago. A team taught a different class. This is what I do now. I just team teach classes in subjects I know nothing about with people who are the experts. In this particular class is a class in bioethics. I don't know anything about bioethics, but I described myself as the pedagogical Sherpa. So I was the person who helped create the pedagogies. But this was a class in bioethics. These are our topics: medical treatment, doctor-assisted suicide, sexual refusal, enhancement, and the ethics of mass trauma. Bioethics is a very complicated field that really is at the boundaries of theory and practice, policy and philosophy. And one of the easiest things there is to do in studying something like bioethics is to make really broad claims. So one of the greatest emphases was that we tried to teach our students accountable talk. Right? So like a lot of people, you know, between classes, students would blog, and then Maggie and I would go through, pick out certain blog posts that we felt were exemplary of either good or bad or medium behavior. Right? So this is Andy, we'll call him Andy, right, who was known for making huge, broad claims, right, that he couldn't really back up. So this is like what a typical day in class we'd start off with. My co-teacher Maggie was particularly good at this. She'd say, "So Andy, so you blogged last night at 2 in the morning. The agency a patient has in any sort of medical predicament should and must always be paramount," right? Meaning that the patient's wishes are always paramount, right? So everybody else in the class can think about that, but Andy, maybe like between last night and this morning, maybe you want to kind of think about that and just ask, is there anything about this sentence that maybe you can think of a single exception to this sentence? Andy thinks about it and says, well, I guess maybe if the patient is a child. Yeah, now that's a good example of where the patients will, well, I think maybe if the patient is mentally disabled. Yeah, that would be another good example where the patient, so like 15 minutes later, the board is covered with exceptions to this sentence. Right? And Andy's in the fetal position underneath the desk by this point. But every day, sort of picking away at that, like what you say in the blog, what you think, like you're accountable for, and every day modeling by scaling up 2 or 3 examples, right? So we're not reading and responding to everybody, but every day making people feel like they're accountable for what they're thinking. So it so happened, this was 3 years ago, when we were teaching this course, something fantastic happened. It now seems funny to say it. The Obama administration had a huge debacle related to healthcare. That was like a couple debacles ago, right? That was when the Obama administration announced that part of the Affordable Care Act would be that everyone had to cover contraception, right? I'm in a Catholic institution, Georgetown's a Catholic institution. This was a pretty big deal. Sandra Fluke, who was grilled in front of Congress, Georgetown law student, very present on campus. So this was like a tailor-made thing for us. So we basically rewrote the entire syllabus for 6 weeks, and we decided we wanted to make a public website. Right? If you remember, you may not remember at the time, whether it was Rush Limbaugh or whomever, things got very ugly. So we wanted to make a public website to educate the public on this issue from a bioethical perspective. Right? So while we did other things and more or less kept to the syllabus, the entire class got involved building a website which went public called Contraception and Conscience. Right? And the whole purpose, this was a mission statement written by the students, was they wanted to create a balanced site on an issue for which reasonable people could disagree, in which people could become educated. We did an initial survey of where people stood on the issue. It wasn't quite 50-50, but we had a bunch of people who fell on one side versus the other. We made them work on the other side. Right? So our classroom space, there's Maggie, typical classroom day, right? Couldn't even tell if that's the teacher. One of the students' self-assessments, it was important to stay unbiased and simply look at the sources from the perspective of explaining the meaning and adding more depth to the conversation. The point that I want to make, to generalize, that was so fascinating, was the tremendous sense of responsibility. And I'm guessing that a lot of the students who have projects out there feel the same thing, a tremendous sense of responsibility to get it right, to get the bioethics right. The relationship between accountable talk and a sense of responsibility to a public. That's what I think goes on in this space. And this is a phenomenon that I called a couple of years ago when I wrote an article, Disrupting Ourselves. That we already know enough. We already know enough about quality learning to know that where people spend a lot of their time in school is not the highest impact place where they could spend their time. There are ways to think about that, but we already know enough to be impatient with the structures of our institutions. Disrupting ourselves. But of course, the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about us being disrupted, right, by the outside. And I know you guys have been facing this and thinking about this. So here's my brief history of the last 3 years of higher education. It was only in fall 2011, just fall of 2011, when Stanford University invented online learning. That's a joke. They think they invented online learning, right? It's really taken off since then. So they invented online learning, remember 160,000 people in Sebastian Thrun's course, etc. Then I like to think that for like 15 minutes, MOOCs were cool. Then there was like an 18-month period where every college and university in the United States went extinct. Right? You read about it in Time Magazine and New York Times. You see that all of us ceased to exist. All of our dorms became condos. Everybody was learning online. No universities left. That was like 18 months to 2 years. Then like stuff started happening in California, and Udacity kind of went bad, and San Jose started getting ugly. Then MOOCs were not cool. Then MOOCs went extinct, and now everything's fine. And that's the last 3 years of the history of higher education. So, and I know you have MOOCs, and I run our MOOCs too, so this is like MOOCish self-hatred. But of course, people were long predicting, this is the Gartner Group's hype cycle for all technology trends, right? And then this is as applied to MOOCs, right, according to the Gartner Group, right? All technology is overvalued in the short run and undervalued for its impact in the long run. So what I'm interested in is that slope that starts going up to 2033. Right? And for me, those external forces of disruption are four. I'll just bring all these up onto the screen. Right? So on the one hand, it doesn't affect places like Vanderbilt and Georgetown very much, but there's a whole federal push toward productivity and access. Right? Obama just wants to measure by graduation rates or first-year earnings. Right? There's the whole world of MOOCs. There's the whole world of startups and for-profits. And I could fill a whole screen with places that you can now get learning outside of schools. Code Academy, Khan Academy, General Assembly, lynda.com, right? Straighterline, Newton. Places filling with them. And then there's data analytics, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is what MOOCs are about, right? People focused on Harvard elite video star professors, but the reason that there are hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital flowing into the MOOC space is because of data analytics. Okay. So here's my second assertion, that the great tension that we're working out right now is not between online and face-to-face education. It's not between large-scale education and small-scale education. It's great tension between integration and disintegration, between two visions of learning. Okay? A couple of years ago, I went to a gathering that was pulled together by the White House in the Department of Education. It was called Innovation to Improve Productivity in Education. They didn't even throw the word quality in the title just to make us happy. And these were all the startups, edX, Coursera, Udacity, Straighterline, Newton, Pearson, talking to educators, saying things like this, right? I have 150,000 data points about your students that you don't have. That's the CEO of Newton. Right? People saying that we need to be able to, we can now figure out learning down to the nano level. We can now figure out learning to the subatomic concept level. We have to be able to make teaching a science. I kept thinking, I've been like doing technology-enhanced learning for the last 20 years. Do I feel empowered or diminished by this conversation? So, the gold standard, the thing that's driving this dream, is sort of represented by the Open Learning Initiative, which is really the best of this kind of data-driven adaptive learning, right? It comes out of Carnegie Mellon, where they basically build these very robust environments that as you're going through them as a student, the system is telling you all kinds of information about yourself. So let me play you a quick clip. I have to leave the confines of... the speaker is Oded Meyer, who is, teaches at Georgetown now, but he was at Carnegie Mellon. He was one of the people who created the Open Learning Initiative statistics course.
features of the OLI system is that students are getting immediate and targeted feedback as they learn the material. And it's interesting because students, when they first interact with the material and they make a mistake and then suddenly they get a feedback and say, oh, this is what you thought, but this is where your mistake is, they're usually in the beginning quite astonished, thinking, well, how did the computer know that that's what I was thinking? The activities are essentially designed like what we call what a good tutor would do. And that is, let the students try. If they get it wrong, they will explain to them why they're getting it wrong and maybe try to give them a hint to put them on the right path. If they're making another mistake, they'll again give the feedback and so on. We were sort of in search of the perfect blend between an online system and face-to-face instructor. For students to have a person in front of them, someone that will make them enthusiastic about the material, is very important. And no machine in the world will ever be able to substitute for an enthusiastic and inspiring teacher. So we were sort of playing with this combination of online materials and instruction. And we ended up using it in a very interesting way, where the students go through the material on their own, interact with the material, go through the activities, get immediate feedback, understand what it is that they're not understanding, they're given a chance to reflect on their own understanding. So the level of interaction with the material is very deep on the student's part. So when they come to lecture, they've already gone through the material, and beyond that, they understand what it is that they're not getting. On the other hand, when I, as the instructor, when I come to the lecture, I'm also loaded with the same information from my side. I know what the students are struggling with. I know what I do not need to spend time on. I know which examples I should prepare that maybe target very specific misconceptions that the students have. So the time in the classroom is used by far more effectively.
It wasn't there at first, was it? Okay, thank you. So this is the most tested adaptive system ever, multiple randomized trials, etc. And they found that using this blended model of the online OLI system plus in-class, much less in-class time, that students can actually accomplish in 8 to 9 weeks with more learning than what students can learn in a traditional statistics class of 15 weeks. Right? Of which then ODED can now spend more time either on advanced topics or on topics of the student's own choosing. Or you could shorten the whole semester to 8 weeks. But this is the dream driving everyone, is that somehow this kind of power of analytics and some sort of inspirational teacher is going to greatly accelerate and improve productivity. Not all topics can be taught this way, absolutely, but this is the dream. Right? When people talk about breaking the iron triangle, it's the idea of personalizing learning through data at scale. And when you listen to these people from Silicon Valley talk, it's all about personalization and personalizing learning through data. So this is what I think of as the split logic of the learning paradigm. So they're both visions of learning. They're both visions that have really been born out of what happened in the 90s, that Barr and Tagg called the learning paradigm. They're both driven by outcomes. They're both driven by evidence. But one is a vision of learning that's just very granular and disconnected from a larger context. And the other is a vision of that kind of competency-based learning that's connected to a sense of whole human development. So it's not that the disintegrated version is bad, it's just that it needs to be harnessed by the integrative version. Even the version that gives us the willies is devoted to student learning. That's not a term I use with Georgetown alumni who are actually have high net worth in the ed tech field, but this is part of that design challenge. What then should universities be if, with the explosion of all the options for learning around us, a ubiquitous information environment, and an incredibly highly developed analytics environment that increasingly is customizing our learning the way that everything else in our lives is customizing to us? Healthcare, Amazon recommendations. Right? What is possible in a university when that will be the case, when that will be the foundation? So this is what I think of as the recentered curriculum. And it's simply this: that over the next 10 to 20 years, this is what's going to happen, right? This is how I now, if you'll notice, these are the circles from my earlier slides, repurposed, right? This is now the formal undergraduate curriculum and the experiential co-curriculum connected. Part of what has happened during the MOOC revolution is that the generic and interchangeable parts of the curriculum have been exposed as generic and interchangeable. How many Introduction to Statistics courses were taught in the United States this year? So a portion of every university's curriculum is generic and interchangeable. A portion. But it didn't matter, because you had to buy the whole bundle. Right? And a portion of every university's curriculum is irreducibly local. You're in Nashville, or you're Jesuit and Catholic in Washington, D.C. You're residential. There's a part that's absolutely distinctive to this place. There's a part of the curriculum, which I would say where students live, which is the highest impact part of the formal curriculum meets the most learning-intensive part of the co-curriculum. And when I interview first-year Georgetown students, seniors, alumni, and I ask them, where was your most intense learning experiences? They'll always talk about one or two courses, and otherwise they're talking about the co-curriculum. So it's that intersection. That's the sweet spot. And that, to me, is the sweet spot of what we need to focus on and redesign for as we move into this future. Because it's in that sweet spot where we teach people to be full human beings, to be ethical, to be practitioners. Right? You don't train people to be nurses or teachers or doctors or engineers online. To have judgment, to be empathetic. That's what happens in that high-impact sweet spot. But our universities are not optimized to put most of our resources into that sweet spot. That's, to me, the locus of integrative learning. That's the place where it seems to me we're not just teaching skills, and we're not just teaching knowledge or content, but we're teaching what's increasingly called dispositions, mental capacities, mindsets, things like resilience, risk-taking, grit, empathy, or even compassion. Right? That's the place where people learn how to put together their story, what Marcia Baxter McGolda calls self-authorship. And it's the place where people learn how to contribute to a knowledge community, which is what's going on out there. Right? To answer unstructured questions or unstructured problems, to work on wicked problems. That's what's happening in that space, I think. And that's, I think, the design challenge. What will universities be for in 2030? I'm running an initiative for the president and provost at Georgetown called Designing the Futures of the University. And to kick off that, our president gave a talk in which he said that there were three things that made a university a university. That we form men and women, right? Formation, very Jesuit word. The formation of men and women. That we create knowledge, and that we serve the public good and the common good. But he said what matters is that those three things are absolutely inseparable and interlocking. We don't just form men and women, we form them in the company of people who have spent their lives looking into, inquiring into a single question. Right? Other places form men and women. The Army, the armed services form men and women and do a really good job of it. But it's not in the company of people who've spent their lives in inquiry. And there are other places in our society that do research and create knowledge, but they don't necessarily do it driven by the common good and the public good. And that to create knowledge for the public good means the way you're forming men and women is completely different. They're absolutely interlocked and inseparable. So there's a saying in the 19th century that the railroads who thought they were in the railroad business went out of business. And the railroads who figured out they were in the transportation business survived. So the question is, what business are we in? What's our equivalent of the transportation business? It's probably something like the formation business, or the transformation business, or the integration business. But for me, it seems clear that if we think that we're in the business of content, or skills, or information transfer, then by 2030, we're going to have a lot of competition. Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of our event here today. We're not quite done. We have refreshments and cupcakes down at the other end of the hall. I want to say a special thank you to lots of people. I want to thank all the folks who shared today in some way, shared their work, shared their projects, shared their ideas, their enthusiasm. Thank you, Randy, for being here and helping us rethink what our mission is, what education is about, who we can be as a university. I really appreciate it. One more round of applause for